The story begins in 2019, in the quaint town of Maplewood, where everything seemed calm and perfect on the surface. Lisa McAllister, a 38-year-old elementary school teacher, had spent her adult life juggling two identities: the loving wife of her high school sweetheart, Daniel, and the glue holding together her small-town community. To anyone on the outside looking in, Lisa was the definition of stability. Her days were filled with bake sales, PTA meetings, and smiling kids. But behind the polished exterior, something was brewing. Lisa's husband, Daniel, was a 41-year-old carpenter known for his rugged charm and a smile that could light up a room. He was the kind of guy who'd spend hours fixing a neighbor's fence for free, then come home and build a treehouse for his kids. Together, Lisa and Daniel were a power couple in Maplewood, living in a cozy two-story home with their two children, 12-year-old Sophie and 8-year-old Jake. On this particular Friday evening, Lisa was in the kitchen, her hands deftly chopping vegetables for dinner. The smell of roasting chicken filled the house, mingling with the faint hum of Jake's video game in the living room. Sophie sat at the kitchen table, scrolling through her phone while pretending to do homework. The scene was warm, domestic, and peaceful, at least on the surface. Daniel came in through the back door, his boots covered in sawdust. He leaned against the counter, grabbing an apple from the bowl. "Smells great," he said with his signature grin. "Long day?" Lisa asked, glancing over her shoulder. "Yeah," Daniel replied. "Mrs. Turner's porch was a mess, but I think we got it squared away." Lisa nodded, her expression pleasant but distant. Over the years, this had become their rhythm, a polite exchange of words that barely scratched the surface of their lives. Later that night, after the kids were tucked in, Lisa sat in the living room with a glass of wine, scrolling through her phone. She paused on a text message from her best friend. "Megan, need to talk. Call me when you can." Lisa hesitated for a moment before dialing. Megan answered almost immediately, her voice low. "Hey, you alone?" "Yeah, what's up?" Lisa asked, sensing the urgency. There was a pause before Megan said, "I was at Joe's bar last night, and I think I saw Daniel with someone." Lisa's stomach tightened. "What do you mean, with someone?" "He was in the corner booth, sitting way too close to some blonde. They were laughing, and, Lisa, it didn't look good." Lisa's grip on the phone tightened. "Are you sure it was him?" "I'm sure," Megan said. "I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but I thought you should know." Lisa ended the call with a vague promise to look into it. But her mind was already racing. She tried to push the thought aside. Daniel wasn't the type. He was devoted, hardworking, and dependable. But as she lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, doubt began to creep in. Little things she'd brushed off over the years suddenly came rushing back. The late nights at work, the unexplained absences, the change in his cologne that he never mentioned. The next day, Lisa decided to confront Daniel, but subtly. At breakfast, she casually asked, "Do you ever go to Joe's bar after work?" Daniel looked up from his plate, his expression neutral. "Sometimes." "Why?" "No reason," Lisa said, forcing a smile. "Megan mentioned she thought she saw you there the other night." He shrugged. "Probably. I stopped by for a drink after finishing Mrs. Turner's porch." Lisa nodded, but something in his tone, or maybe the way he avoided her gaze, didn't sit right with her. She spent the rest of the day in a fog, replaying Megan's words and Daniel's reaction over and over in her mind. That evening, while Daniel took the kids to the park, Lisa sat at his desk in their shared home office. She knew it was a violation of trust, but curiosity, or maybe desperation, pushed her to open his laptop. She searched for anything that might explain the unease she felt. Emails, messages, anything. At first, there was nothing unusual, but then she found a folder labeled Personal. Inside the folder were receipts, hotel bookings, expensive dinners, jewelry she'd never seen. Her hands trembled as she clicked through them, the pieces of a puzzle she didn't want to solve falling into place. When Daniel and the kids returned home, Lisa acted as if everything was normal. She smiled, helped Jake with his homework, and listened to Sophie talk about her friends. But inside, she was unraveling. That night, After everyone was asleep, Lisa went for a walk. The cool night air helped clear her head, but the weight of what she'd found was crushing. She didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to believe that the man she'd built her life with could betray her. The next morning, she called Megan. "You were right," Lisa said, her voice flat. "There's someone else." Megan was silent for a moment before asking, "What are you going to do?" "I don't know," Lisa admitted, "but I'm not going to let him get away with it." Lisa spent the next week gathering evidence. She followed Daniel's movements closely, noting every suspicious behavior. She even hired a private investigator, a decision that made her feel both empowered and sick to her stomach. She was stepping into a world she never thought she'd be a part of, a world where trust was a currency easily spent and rarely replenished. When the investigator delivered his report, Lisa's worst fears were confirmed. Daniel had been seeing someone, a younger woman named Heather who worked at the hardware store he frequented. They'd been meeting at hotels, sharing meals at out-of-town restaurants, and exchanging gifts. Lisa stared at the photos, her heart breaking and hardening at the same time. This wasn't just a fling. It was deliberate, calculated. She couldn't pretend anymore. She had to act. Lisa sat in her car outside Sophie's school, gripping the steering wheel as the rain pattered against the windshield. She'd been in this spot for 20 minutes, trying to compose herself before picking up her daughter. The images from the investigator's report flashed in her mind. Daniel and Heather laughing over dinner, walking into a hotel arm in arm. Lisa thought she had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have braced her for the reality of betrayal. That evening, she tried to act normal, at least for the kids. Sophie went on about a group project due next week, and Jake begged her for extra time on his video games. Daniel seemed oblivious to the tension, chatting about a new client who wanted custom-built bookshelves. But Lisa noticed everything now. The way he glanced at his phone, the slight smile when a text notification popped up, the hollow tone in his small talk. After dinner, when the kids were upstairs, Lisa decided it was time to confront him, carefully. She wasn't ready to lay all her cards on the table just yet. She needed to know if he would confess or double down on the lies. "Daniel," she said, leaning against the kitchen counter, her voice deceptively calm. "Can we talk?" He looked up from his phone, startled. "Of course. What's up?" "I've been feeling off lately," Lisa began. "Like there's something between us we're not addressing." Daniel's brow furrowed. "Off? What do you mean?" She hesitated, searching his face for any flicker of guilt. "I don't know. You've been distant, distracted." He sighed, setting his phone down. "Lisa, work's been crazy. You know how it is. I'm not distracted. I'm just tired." She wanted to scream. Instead, she nodded slowly. "Maybe." He walked over, placing a hand on her shoulder. "I love you, Lisa. You know that, right?" Lisa swallowed hard, forcing herself to smile. "Yeah, I know." But she didn't. Not anymore. The next few days were a blur of routine and reconnaissance. Lisa couldn't stop herself from checking Daniel's phone while he showered or digging through the receipts in his truck. Each piece of evidence was like a dagger to her heart, but she needed the full picture. She had to be sure. By the weekend, she had her confirmation and then some. A voicemail on his phone from Heather, thanking him for their amazing night, was the final nail in the coffin. That Saturday, Lisa called Megan. "I need a plan," she said, pacing her bedroom. "I can't keep pretending." Megan didn't hesitate. "You need a lawyer, and you need to protect yourself. Financially, emotionally, everything." Lisa agreed, but she wasn't ready to make any drastic moves yet. Instead, she decided to play along, gathering as much leverage as possible before confronting Daniel outright. It was a painful game, pretending everything was fine while her world crumbled beneath her. But Lisa had always been good at keeping up appearances. On Monday morning, Lisa met with a lawyer recommended by Megan. The office was small but professional, and the lawyer, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Julia, got straight to the point. "You have options," Julia said, flipping through the investigator's report. "But the key here is strategy. You don't just want a divorce, you want to come out of this on top." Lisa nodded, feeling a surge of determination. I want to make sure he doesn't get away with this. Julia smiled. Good. Then let's talk about your next steps. They spent the next hour outlining a plan. Lisa would quietly separate her finances from Daniel's, document everything, and wait for the right moment to confront him. It wasn't a quick fix, but it was a start. Over the next week, Lisa followed the plan meticulously. She opened her own bank account, transferred her paychecks, and started cataloging all their joint assets. It was exhausting, keeping up the charade while working, parenting, and managing the fallout of Daniel's betrayal. But every time she felt like breaking down, she reminded herself of the bigger picture, protecting herself and her kids. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed completely unaware of Lisa's growing resolve. He went about his days as if nothing had changed, texting Heather under the table and disappearing for work meetings that Lisa knew were anything but. One evening, Lisa finally decided to test him. As they sat on the couch watching a movie, she casually said, Megan invited us to dinner tomorrow night. Should I tell her we're free? Daniel froze for a split second before forcing a smile. I can't. I've got a late meeting with a client. Lisa raised an eyebrow. On a Tuesday night? Yeah, he said quickly. It's the only time they're available. She nodded, keeping her expression neutral. Okay, I'll just go without you then. Daniel looked relieved. Sounds good. The next evening, while Daniel was supposedly at his meeting, Lisa drove to the address the investigator had given her. A small boutique hotel on the edge of town. Her heart pounded as she sat in the parking lot, watching the entrance. Sure enough, after 10 minutes, Daniel walked out with Heather on his arm. Lisa snapped a photo, her hands shaking. This wasn't just about betrayal anymore. It was about justice. By the time Lisa returned home, she was seething. She had everything she needed. Proof, a plan, and a lawyer on her side. But the hardest part was yet to come. She had to decide when and how to confront him. That night, as Daniel slept beside her, Lisa stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. She thought about their wedding day, the vows they had exchanged, the life they had built together. How had it come to this? How had the man she loved turned into a stranger? For the first time in weeks, Lisa allowed herself to cry. Not for Daniel, but for the life she thought she had. A life that was gone forever. A few days later, Lisa decided it was time to act. She picked a quiet evening after the kids had gone to bed and asked Daniel to sit down in the living room. There's something we need to talk about, she said, her voice steady. Daniel frowned, sensing the seriousness in her tone. What is it? Lisa took a deep breath, pulling out her phone. She opened the folder of photos and held it out to him. Explain this. Daniel's face went pale as he scrolled through the images. Him and Heather at the hotel, at the restaurant, in the park. Lisa, don't, she said sharply, cutting him off. Don't lie to me. He set the phone down, running a hand through his hair. I screwed up, okay? But it's not what you think. Lisa laughed bitterly. Not what I think. You've been sneaking around for months, cheating on me, and lying to my face. So please enlighten me. What is it? I never meant for it to get this far, Daniel said, his voice desperate. It was a mistake. A mistake, Lisa repeated, her voice dripping with sarcasm. A mistake you made over and over again. I love you, he said, reaching for her hand. Things have been hard between us and Lisa pulled her hand away, her eyes blazing. Don't you dare try to blame this on me. You had a choice, Daniel, and you chose to betray me. He was silent, his guilt written all over his face. Lisa stood, her hands trembling. I deserve better than this. The kids deserve better. Lisa, please. No, she said firmly. We're done. Daniel looked like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He just sat there, staring at the floor, as Lisa walked out of the room. Upstairs, she checked on Sophie and Jake, who were both sound asleep. For the first time in weeks, Lisa felt a strange sense of peace. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing. She was stronger than she'd ever realized. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. Stay tuned for the next chapter of Lisa's journey as she takes control of her life and faces the challenges ahead. Lisa stood in the kitchen the morning after confronting Daniel, the weight of the previous night pressing on her chest. She had barely slept, her mind racing with thoughts of what her next move should be. The betrayal felt fresh, raw, and unrelenting, but she knew she couldn't afford to falter. Sophie and Jake were up early, laughing over pancakes like nothing had changed. For their sake, Lisa forced a smile, masking the turmoil inside her. Daniel, however, didn't make an appearance at breakfast. He'd slept on the couch after their confrontation, a quiet acknowledgement that his actions had placed him on the outside of their family. Lisa wasn't ready to tell the kids yet. She needed to be sure of her next steps before dropping a bombshell on their young lives. As she sipped her coffee, her phone buzzed with a message from Julia, her lawyer. "We should meet. There are steps we can take now to protect your assets and prepare for custody discussions." Lisa clenched her jaw. This was all becoming so real. But as painful as it was, she knew she had to push forward. She texted back, "I'll come by after school drop-off." An hour later, Lisa sat in Julia's office, the blinds drawn and her heart pounding as she explained the events of the previous night. Julia listened intently, taking notes. "You've got leverage," Julia said after Lisa finished recounting everything. "The photos, the receipts, even his confession. Those will play heavily in your favor if we need to take this to court. But there's one thing I need to ask. Do you want to try mediation? Or are you ready to fight this out?" Lisa hesitated. Part of her wanted to avoid a messy, drawn-out battle for the sake of the kids. But the other part, the part that had spent the last few months unraveling Daniel's lies, wanted justice. "I want what's fair," Lisa said finally. "And I want to make sure the kids come out of this okay." Julia nodded. "Then we'll approach this strategically. First, we file for legal separation. That will protect your finances and establish boundaries. After that, we'll move to negotiate custody and division of assets. If he cooperates, it doesn't have to get ugly." "And if he doesn't?" Lisa asked. Julia gave a small, knowing smile. "Then we make it ugly." Over the next week, Lisa began to rebuild her life piece by piece. She threw herself into work, finding solace in the structured chaos of her classroom. Her students, oblivious to her personal struggles, greeted her with smiles and stories that reminded her of the joy and simplicity that life could still hold. At home, she focused on keeping things as normal as possible for Sophie and Jake, though the tension between her and Daniel was impossible to ignore. Daniel had taken to leaving the house early and returning late, avoiding any real interaction with Lisa. He spent his evenings in the garage, claiming he was working on a new project, but Lisa suspected he was just hiding. Part of her wanted to confront him again, to force him to face the consequences of his actions, but she knew it wasn't the right time. Instead, she channeled her energy into preparing for the next step. She met with Julia regularly, gathering documents, reviewing their financial situation, and outlining her goals for the separation. Each meeting brought a mix of relief and dread. Relief that she was taking control, and dread at the thought of how messy things could become. The breaking point came one Friday evening, 2 weeks after their initial confrontation. Lisa had just put Jake to bed and was heading downstairs when she heard Daniel talking on the phone in the kitchen. His voice was low, but the tension in his tone was unmistakable. "I told you I can't just leave," he said. "She's already suspicious, and the kids. It's not that simple." Lisa froze at the top of the stairs, her heart racing. She crept down silently, stopping just out of sight to hear more. "No, I haven't told her yet," Daniel continued. "I need more time. Just trust me. Okay?" Lisa's hands clenched into fists. He was still lying, still stringing Heather along while pretending to work things out at home. The audacity of it all made her blood boil. She couldn't stay silent any longer. She stepped into the kitchen, her voice cold and steady. "Who are you talking to, Daniel?" Daniel jumped, his phone slipping from his hand and clattering onto the counter. His face went pale as he turned to face her. Lisa, Don't bother, she said, cutting him off. I already know. You're still seeing her, aren't you? Daniel's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. The guilt in his eyes said everything. Lisa took a step closer, her anger rising. You said you made a mistake. You said you wanted to fix this. But you're still lying. Still cheating. Do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? I didn't want it to end like this, Daniel said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. But I don't know how to fix it. You don't get to fix it, Lisa snapped. Not anymore. She turned and walked out of the kitchen, her chest heaving with anger and heartbreak. In that moment, she knew there was no going back. Whatever hope she'd held on to, however small, was gone. The next morning, Lisa met with Julia to finalize the legal separation. She felt a strange sense of relief as she signed the papers, like a weight she hadn't realized she was carrying had been lifted. You're doing the right thing, Julia said as Lisa handed over the signed documents. This is the first step toward a better future. Lisa nodded, though the thought of the road ahead still filled her with uncertainty. What happens next? Next, we serve him the papers, Julia said. Then we wait and see how he responds. Lisa took a deep breath. Okay, let's do it. The following evening, Daniel was served the papers at work. Lisa had deliberately chosen not to do it at home, wanting to avoid a scene in front of the kids. When he returned that night, his face was a mix of anger and defeat. You're really doing this? He asked, holding up the envelope. I am, Lisa said, her voice calm but firm. And you have no one to blame but yourself. Daniel sat down heavily at the kitchen table, running a hand through his hair. I screwed up. I know that. But do we really have to go through lawyers? Can't we just figure this out on our own? Lisa crossed her arms, standing her ground. You had plenty of chances to figure this out, Daniel. I'm done giving you chances. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Okay, if this is what you want. It's what I need, Lisa said. Over the next few weeks, the tension in the house only grew. Daniel tried to act like everything was normal around the kids, but Lisa could see the cracks in his facade. He was struggling to accept the reality of their situation, while Lisa was focused on moving forward. Sophie and Jake began to pick up on the tension, and one evening, Sophie finally confronted Lisa. Mom, what's going on with you and Dad? She asked, her voice hesitant. Lisa hesitated, unsure of how much to say. Your dad and we're going through a tough time right now, she said carefully. But no matter what happens, we both love you and Jake very much. Sophie looked unconvinced but didn't press further. Lisa knew the time would come when she'd have to explain everything. But for now, she wanted to shield her kids from the full weight of the truth. Lisa's resolve was tested one evening when Heather showed up at their house. Lisa had been in the middle of helping Jake with his homework when she heard the knock at the door. She opened it to find Heather standing there, looking nervous and defiant. I need to talk to Daniel, Heather said, her voice trembling. Lisa stared at her for a moment, then stepped aside. He's in the garage. Heather hesitated, clearly taken aback by Lisa's calm demeanor. Thank you, she said quietly before heading toward the garage. Lisa closed the door and returned to the kitchen, her heart pounding. She didn't know what would come of their conversation, but one thing was clear. The tangled web Daniel had woven was finally unraveling. In the garage, Heather confronted Daniel, her voice rising as she demanded answers. Why haven't you told her yet? You said you were leaving. I never said it would be easy, Daniel shot back. I'm trying to figure things out. Heather's voice cracked with frustration. You're not figuring anything out. You're just stringing me along. Lisa listened from the kitchen, her hands shaking as the argument spilled out into the night. She felt a strange mix of vindication and sadness. This was the life Daniel had chosen, the chaos, the lies, the betrayal. And now it was all coming to a head. Heather stormed out of the garage after her heated argument with Daniel, slamming the door behind her. Lisa watched through the kitchen window as Heather's car sped down the street. The sound of the engine fading into the night brought an odd sense of satisfaction. For once, Daniel's lies were unraveling in real time, and he had no way to hide it. Moments later, Daniel walked into the house, his face flushed with frustration. He paused when he saw Lisa leaning against the counter, arms crossed, watching him. "What?" he snapped, his usual calm demeanor cracking. Lisa raised an eyebrow. "Rough night." Daniel groaned, rubbing his temples. "You have no idea." "Oh, I think I do," Lisa said coolly. "That was Heather, wasn't it?" He didn't answer, but his silence spoke volumes. Lisa stepped closer, her voice low but firm. "Do you realize what you've done? You've not only destroyed this family but also dragged her into this mess. And for what? Some fleeting thrill." Daniel looked away, guilt flickering in his eyes. "It's not that simple, Lisa." "It is that simple," she shot back. "You made a choice, a selfish, cowardly choice, and now you're facing the consequences." Daniel opened his mouth to argue but stopped. For the first time in weeks, he seemed at a loss for words. The next morning, Lisa woke up determined to take the next step. She scheduled a meeting with Julia to discuss accelerating the divorce process. She was done waiting for Daniel to step up or take responsibility. If he wasn't going to fix this, she would do it herself. Meanwhile, Daniel's behavior became increasingly erratic. He spent most of his time at work or in the garage, avoiding Lisa and the kids as much as possible. When he was home, the tension was unbearable. Sophie and Jake noticed, of course, but neither of them said anything. They just exchanged worried glances, their usual laughter replaced by an uneasy silence. Lisa hated that her children were caught in the middle of this mess, but she knew the only way out was forward. That weekend, Sophie came to Lisa with tears in her eyes. "Mom, is everything okay? You and Dad. You're not talking anymore." Lisa's heart broke at the sight of her daughter's distress. She knelt down, taking Sophie's hands in hers. "Sweetheart, your dad and I are going through a tough time right now, but I promise you, we both love you and Jake very much." Sophie wiped her tears. "Are you getting a divorce?" Lisa hesitated, then nodded. "Yes, but that doesn't change how much we love you. You and Jake are the most important things in our lives." Sophie hugged her tightly, and Lisa held her close, silently vowing to protect her children from the fallout as much as she could. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday evening. Lisa was in the living room, reviewing paperwork for the divorce, when she heard a knock at the door. She opened it to find Megan standing there, looking flustered. "Megan? What's wrong?" "I just came from Joe's bar," Megan said, stepping inside. "You need to hear this." Lisa frowned. "Hear what?" Megan hesitated, then said, "Daniel was there. He was talking to someone about leaving town. He said he couldn't handle the pressure anymore." Lisa's stomach dropped. "What do you mean, leaving town?" "I don't know," Megan said, "but it didn't sound good. I thought you should know." Lisa thanked her and sat down, her mind racing. If Daniel was planning to leave, it could complicate everything. Custody, finances, the divorce proceedings. She couldn't let that happen. That night, Lisa confronted Daniel once again. She found him in the garage, pretending to work on a project, though it was clear his mind was elsewhere. "Are you planning to leave?" she asked, her voice steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Daniel looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "Megan saw you at Joe's," Lisa said. "She heard you talking about leaving town." Daniel sighed, setting down his tools. "I wasn't serious. I was just venting." "Venting?" Lisa repeated, her anger rising. "Do you have any idea what you're putting us through? What you're putting the kids through?" "I didn't ask for this," Daniel shot back. "You're the one pushing for a divorce." Lisa laughed bitterly. "Don't you dare try to make this my fault. You cheated, Daniel. You lied to me, to the kids, to everyone. And now, instead of facing the consequences, you're thinking about running away." "I'm not running away," he said, though his tone was less convincing with each word. I don't know how to fix this." "Then stop trying to fix it and start owning up to it," Lisa said. "If you care about this family at all, you'll stay and deal with the mess you've made." Daniel didn't respond. He just stared at the floor, the weight of his actions finally beginning to sink in. The next few days were a whirlwind of activity. Lisa worked with Julia to file additional paperwork, ensuring that Daniel couldn't leave town without facing legal repercussions. She also began reaching out to therapists and support groups, determined to create a stable environment for Sophie and Jake. Meanwhile, Daniel seemed to be spiraling. He showed up late to work, missed important deadlines, and avoided Lisa as much as possible. It was clear he was struggling to cope, but Lisa couldn't afford to focus on his problems anymore. She had her own life to rebuild. The breaking point came on a Saturday afternoon. Lisa was in the backyard, watching Jake play with the dog, when Daniel approached her. "I want to talk," he said, his voice quieter than usual. Lisa crossed her arms, bracing herself. "Go ahead." Daniel took a deep breath. "I know I've screwed up. I know I've hurt you and the kids in ways I can't take back. But I want to try to make things right." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "And how do you plan to do that?" "I'll sign the divorce papers," he said. "I'll cooperate with whatever you need. I don't want to lose the kids." Lisa studied him, searching for sincerity in his eyes. For the first time in months, he seemed genuine. Not defensive, not deflecting, just raw and honest. "You should have thought about that before," she said, her voice firm but not unkind. "But if you're serious about putting the kids first, then prove it. Show up for them. Be the father they deserve." Daniel nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I will. I promise." Lisa didn't respond. She wasn't ready to trust him again, but at least it was a step in the right direction. By the end of the week, Daniel had signed the divorce papers, and Lisa felt a sense of closure she hadn't expected. It wasn't the end of the journey. There were still custody arrangements to finalize and emotions to process, but it was a significant step forward. Lisa sat on the porch that evening, watching the sunset. For the first time in months, she felt a glimmer of hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy, but she knew she was strong enough to handle it. And this time, she wasn't alone. She had her kids, her friends, and a newfound sense of resilience guiding her toward a brighter future. As the divorce proceedings moved forward, tensions in the McAllister household reached a boiling point. Daniel, while outwardly cooperating, still struggled to accept the reality of what he had lost. Lisa, on the other hand, was determined to push through, her focus on creating a stable future for Sophie and Jake. But stability was far from what their family experienced during those final weeks under the same roof. One evening, as Lisa was helping Sophie with a school project, she noticed Daniel standing in the doorway of the living room. He looked disheveled, his eyes hollow from what Lisa assumed was a mix of sleepless nights and guilt. He cleared his throat, catching both Lisa's and Sophie's attention. "Sophie, can I talk to your mom for a minute?" Daniel asked, his tone uncharacteristically soft. Sophie hesitated, glancing at Lisa for confirmation. Lisa nodded, offering her daughter a reassuring smile. "Go ahead, sweetheart. I'll be up in a few minutes." Once Sophie had left the room, Lisa turned to Daniel, her expression guarded. "What is it?" Daniel stepped further into the room, his hands shoved into his pockets. "I wanted to say I'm sorry for everything." Lisa crossed her arms, her gaze steady. "You've said that before, Daniel. What's different now?" He let out a heavy sigh, sinking into the armchair across from her. "I've been doing a lot of thinking about how I got here, how I let things fall apart. And I realized it wasn't just the affair. It was everything before that. The distance I let grow between us. The way I took you for granted." Lisa raised an eyebrow, not sure where he was going with this. "I'm not saying this to excuse what I did," Daniel continued. "I know I can't take it back, and I know I've lost you, but I don't want to lose my kids too. I want to be better for them." Lisa's expression softened slightly, though her resolve remained firm. "If you mean that, Daniel, then show them. Actions speak louder than words." The following weekend, Daniel surprised Lisa and the kids by suggesting a family outing. It wasn't anything extravagant, just a picnic at the local park, but it was the first time in months he'd made an effort to spend quality time with them. Sophie and Jake were thrilled, their excitement a stark contrast to the tension that had dominated the household. Lisa watched from a distance as Daniel played catch with Jake, his laughter echoing through the park. For a moment, she saw a glimpse of the man she had fallen in love with all those years ago, but the scars of his betrayal were still fresh, and she reminded herself that this was about the kids, not her. Later, as they packed up the picnic, Daniel turned to Lisa. "Thank you for letting me do this." She nodded, her response curt. "It's not about letting you, Daniel. It's about what's best for Sophie and Jake." He didn't argue, just nodded in understanding. Despite Daniel's attempts to redeem himself, the strain of the divorce began to take its toll. One night, after the kids had gone to bed, Lisa found herself in the kitchen, staring at the stack of legal documents on the counter. The weight of it all felt unbearable, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to cry. She didn't hear Daniel come in until he spoke. "Lisa, are you okay?" She wiped her tears quickly, embarrassed to have been caught in such a vulnerable moment. "I'm fine. You don't look fine," he said, his concern genuine. Lisa let out a bitter laugh. "What do you care, Daniel? You're the one who put me here." He flinched but didn't argue. Instead, he pulled out a chair and sat across from her. "You're right. I did. And I hate myself for it." Lisa looked at him, her tears replaced by anger. "Hating yourself doesn't fix anything. It doesn't change what you did." "I know," Daniel said quietly, "but I want to try, even if it's just to make things easier for you and the kids." Lisa studied him, searching for any sign of manipulation. But for the first time in a long time, she saw sincerity in his eyes. "If you're serious about that," she said, her voice steady, "then prove it. Follow through on your promises. Be there for Sophie and Jake. And don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I will," Daniel said. "I swear." In the weeks leading up to their court hearing, Lisa noticed a subtle shift in Daniel's behavior. He started coming home earlier, spending more time with the kids, and even helping around the house. It wasn't enough to erase the damage he had done, but it was a start. One evening, as they were finalizing the custody agreement, Daniel surprised Lisa by suggesting shared custody. "I know I haven't been the best father," he admitted, "but I want to be, and I think the kids need both of us in their lives." Lisa was hesitant at first, but after discussing it with Julia, she agreed. "This isn't about us, Daniel," she said. "It's about what's best for Sophie and Jake." "I know," he said, "and I'll do whatever it takes to make this work." The day of the court hearing arrived, and Lisa felt a mix of nerves and determination as she entered the courtroom. She had spent weeks preparing for this moment, gathering evidence, meeting with Julia, and mentally bracing herself for whatever might come. Daniel was already seated when she arrived, looking more somber than she had ever seen him. As the proceedings began, Lisa couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness. This wasn't how she had envisioned their life together ending. But she reminded herself that this was the right choice, for her and for the kids. The hearing went smoothly, with both sides reaching an agreement on custody and asset division. As they left the courtroom, Daniel turned to Lisa. "Thank you for being fair." Lisa nodded, her emotions a mix of relief and exhaustion. "Let's just focus on moving forward." That evening, as Lisa sat on the porch with a cup of tea, she reflected on everything that had led to this moment. It had been a long, painful journey, but she had come out stronger on the other side. And while she didn't know what the future held, she was finally ready to face it. Inside, Sophie and Jake were playing a board game, their laughter filling the house with a warmth Lisa hadn't felt in months. For the first time in a long time, she allowed herself to smile. This was her new beginning, a chance to rebuild her life and create a better future for herself and her kids. The weeks following the court hearing were tense but surprisingly civil. Lisa and Daniel had worked out a custody schedule that seemed to work for everyone, but the reality of their new lives was only beginning to set in. For Lisa, every interaction with Daniel felt like walking a tightrope, balancing her anger and heartbreak against the need to maintain stability for the kids. One night, after Daniel had dropped Sophie and Jake off following his weekend with them, Lisa noticed something different. Sophie was unusually quiet, her usual chatter replaced by a distant look that Lisa couldn't ignore. "Sophie," Lisa said gently as they sat in the living room. "Is everything okay?" Sophie hesitated, her fingers nervously fidgeting with the hem of her sweater. "Mom, do you think Dad's okay?" Lisa blinked, caught off guard by the question. "What do you mean? He seems different," Sophie said, her voice barely above a whisper, like sad and distracted. Lisa's heart clenched. For all her anger toward Daniel, she couldn't deny that Sophie's concern was genuine. "Your dad's going through a tough time right now," she said carefully, "but I'm sure he's doing his best." Sophie nodded, but the worry didn't leave her face. Later that evening, after the kids were in bed, Lisa sat alone in the kitchen, sipping her tea and thinking about Sophie's words. She knew Daniel was struggling. His behavior over the past few months had made that clear. But part of her couldn't help but wonder if he was finally beginning to understand the depth of the pain he had caused. The next day, Lisa received a call from Daniel. His voice was strained, his words hesitant. "Lisa, can we talk? I mean, really talk?" Lisa sighed, leaning against the counter. "What's this about, Daniel?" I need to apologize again," he said, "for everything. I know I've said it before, but I don't think I ever truly understood what I put you through until now." Lisa was silent for a moment, her emotions swirling. "What brought this on?" Daniel let out a heavy breath. "I've been seeing someone, a counselor. They're helping me work through all of it." Lisa's eyebrows shot up. This was unexpected. "A counselor?" "Yeah," he said. "I realized I couldn't keep running from this, from what I did. And if I'm going to be a better father to Sophie and Jake, I need to fix myself first." Lisa didn't know what to say. For months, she had longed for Daniel to take responsibility for his actions, to show genuine remorse. And now it seemed like he was finally starting to do just that. But was it too little, too late? "I appreciate you telling me," she said finally. "But this doesn't change anything, Daniel. What's done is done." "I know," he said quietly. "I just wanted you to know." Over the next few weeks, Lisa noticed small but significant changes in Daniel. He was more engaged with the kids during his weekends with them, asking about their lives and taking an active interest in their hobbies. He even started attending Sophie's soccer games, something he had rarely done before. Sophie and Jake seemed to notice the difference too. Jake, who had been withdrawn since the separation, started talking more about his time with Daniel, excitedly recounting their trips to the park or afternoons spent building model airplanes. Lisa couldn't deny that the changes were a good thing, for the kids at least. But for her, the wounds of Daniel's betrayal were still too fresh to fully trust his transformation. The climax of their story came on a rainy Saturday afternoon, during one of Daniel's custody weekends. Lisa was at home, catching up on grading papers, when her phone buzzed with an incoming call. It was Sophie. "Mom!" Sophie's voice was panicked. "Dad's hurt." Lisa's heart stopped. "What happened? Where are you?" "We're at the park," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "Dad slipped on the wet grass and fell. He's bleeding." Lisa grabbed her keys, adrenaline coursing through her veins. "Stay where you are. I'm on my way." When Lisa arrived at the park, she found Daniel sitting on a bench, holding a makeshift bandage to his head. Sophie and Jake were by his side, their faces pale with worry. "What happened?" Lisa demanded, kneeling beside Daniel. "I slipped," he said, his voice weak but steady. "Hit my head on a rock. It's not as bad as it looks." Lisa examined the wound. It was a nasty gash, but it didn't appear life-threatening. Still, she wasn't taking any chances. "You need to go to the hospital." Daniel shook his head. "I'm fine." "Stop being stubborn," Lisa snapped. "You're going." At the hospital, while Daniel was being treated, Lisa sat in the waiting room with Sophie and Jake. The kids were still shaken, and Lisa did her best to reassure them. "Your dad's going to be okay," she said, holding their hands. "He's tough. You know that." Sophie nodded, though her eyes were still filled with tears. "Mom, do you still care about Dad?" The question caught Lisa off guard. What do you mean? I mean, do you still love him? Sophie asked, her voice hesitant. Lisa took a deep breath, her emotions swirling. I'll always care about your dad, she said carefully, because he's your father, and because we shared a lot of good years together. But sometimes, caring about someone isn't enough to stay with them. Sophie seemed to accept this answer, though the sadness in her eyes didn't fade. When Daniel was finally discharged, Lisa drove him home. The ride was silent, the tension between them palpable. When they arrived at his apartment, Daniel turned to Lisa, his expression serious. Thank you, he said, for everything, for being there today. Lisa nodded, her grip tightening on the steering wheel. Just take care of yourself, Daniel. The kids need you. I will, he said, his voice filled with quiet determination. I promise. The events of that day marked a turning point for Lisa. For the first time since their separation, she began to feel a sense of closure. Daniel was taking steps to better himself, and while their marriage was beyond repair, Lisa could finally see a path forward, for herself and for her kids. The journey had been long and painful, but Lisa had emerged stronger, more resilient, and ready to embrace whatever came next. The weeks after Daniel's accident were a turning point for everyone involved. For the first time in what felt like forever, Lisa felt a sense of stability creeping back into her life. The chaos that had once consumed her household was starting to fade, replaced by a quieter, more balanced routine. Daniel, true to his word, continued working on himself. He remained consistent with his counseling sessions, which seemed to bring out a version of him that Lisa hadn't seen in years. Present, thoughtful, and patient. While Lisa knew they'd never return to the life they once shared, she saw his efforts as a step toward healing, not just for him but for their family as a whole. One crisp autumn afternoon, Lisa stood on the sidelines of Sophie's soccer game, cheering as her daughter scored the winning goal. Sophie's face lit up as she ran across the field, her confidence shining brighter than Lisa had seen in months. Jake stood next to her, clapping enthusiastically and talking about how he wanted to join a team too. Lisa felt a surge of pride watching her kids thrive despite everything they had been through. She had spent so much time worrying about how the divorce would affect them, but now, she could see their resilience. They were adapting, and so was she. As the game ended, Daniel walked up beside her, carrying a thermos of coffee. He had shown up early, something he rarely did before their separation. She's got your determination, he said, nodding towards Sophie. Lisa glanced at him, surprised by the compliment. Maybe, but she's got your competitive streak. They stood in companionable silence for a moment, watching their kids gather with their teammates. Thanks for letting me be here, Daniel said finally. I know it hasn't been easy. It hasn't, Lisa admitted, but the kids deserve both of us in their lives, and I'll always do what's best for them. Daniel nodded, a flicker of gratitude crossing his face. I'm trying, Lisa. I really am. I know, she said softly, and they see that too. As the weeks turned into months, Lisa found herself carving out a new life. She threw herself into her work, taking on projects she had put off for years. She joined a local book club and even started running in the mornings, something she had always wanted to try but never found the time for. Through it all, Megan remained her rock, encouraging her to embrace her independence and reminding her of how far she had come. You're like a whole new person, Megan said one evening as they shared a bottle of wine on Lisa's porch. Confident, strong, happy. Lisa smiled, feeling a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. I guess I just stopped waiting for things to change and decided to change them myself. The final chapter of Lisa's journey came on a quiet evening at home. She was sitting in the living room, going through old photo albums with Sophie and Jake. They laughed over baby pictures and reminisced about family vacations, their voices filling the house with a warmth that had been missing for so long. As they flipped through the pages, Sophie paused on a photo from her 6th birthday, a picture of Lisa and Daniel smiling as they held a cake decorated with pink frosting and sprinkles. Do you miss when things were like this? Sophie asked, her voice tentative. Lisa looked at the photo for a long moment before answering. I miss the good times, yes, but I don't miss pretending everything was perfect when it wasn't. Sophie nodded, seeming to understand. I think things are better now, even if it's different. They are, Lisa said, pulling her kids into a hug, and they're going to keep getting better. In the months that followed, Lisa and Daniel found a way to co-parent amicably. While their marriage was over, they remained united in their love for Sophie and Jake. Family dinners became a monthly tradition, a way to show the kids that while their parents were no longer together, they were still a family in their own way. Lisa also allowed herself to dream again. She started planning a trip to the mountains, something she and the kids had always talked about but never managed to do. It felt like a symbol of their new beginning, a chance to create new memories and move forward together. One evening, as Lisa sat on the porch watching the sunset, her phone buzzed with a message from Daniel. Thanks for giving me the chance to be a better father. I won't waste it. She stared at the screen for a moment, her emotions a mix of gratitude and sadness. While the pain of their past would never fully disappear, Lisa felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. She replied simply, just keep showing up. That's what matters most. As the seasons changed and life settled into its new rhythm, Lisa realized how far she had come. The woman who had once been consumed by betrayal and heartbreak was now stronger, more confident, and ready to face whatever life threw her way. She had learned that while some chapters of life must come to an end, they often pave the way for new beginnings. And as she looked out at the world ahead of her, Lisa felt a sense of peace, knowing she was exactly where she was meant to be. Thank you for joining me on this journey through Lisa's story. If you enjoyed this recap and want more engaging, emotional stories like this one, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us keep bringing you the stories you love. Until next time, take care and keep watching.